Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99. Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang. Episode 66. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. This is going to be part 2 of one of my absolute favorite stories ever put into the medium of print. Peter Pan. Before we launch into part 2, however, I thought I'd start off with a little poetry. And I'm going to introduce tonight's tonight's poem is by Samuel Foster Damon. He was born in 1893 and lived a long, fruitful life. He passed in 1971. He was born in Newton, Massachusetts, graduated from Harvard in 1914, and returned thereafter returned to Harvard after World War I as an instructor in the English department. His later academic career was at Brown University, where he had positions from 1927. Samuel Foster Damon was a renowned writer and critic on the works of William Blake, an English poet of the Romantic Age. We've talked about William Blake on this show before. His other writings include a biography of Amy Lowell. Damon was one of the Harvard aesthetics, which is a person who is devoted to and emphasizes the beauty of and the cultivation of the arts. Other Harvard aesthetics included E. E. Cummings and John dos Passos, for those of you who have been listening to the poetry in the last 6 weeks or so. So we've also heard entries from the book 8 Harvard Poets, which was published in 1917 previously. I'm going to give you the translation of the title of this poem first. Loosely translated for the expression of this poem, this means walking with a goddess. And walking with a goddess is a direct quote from the Aeneid, which was written between 29 BC and 19 BC by the immortal poet Virgil. The quote is, "By her gait, the goddess was known." That's G-A-I-T. So it's like by her walking pattern, by the way she walks, the goddess was known. So this poem is called Incessu, Patuit, Deus by S. Foster Damon. The little clattering stones along the street dance with each other round my swimming feet. The street itself, as in some crazy dream, streaks past a half-perceived material stream. Brighter than early dawn's most brilliant dye are blown clear bands of color through the sky that swirl and sweep and meet to break and foam like rainbow veils upon a bubble's dome. Yours are the songs that burst about my ears or blow away as many colored spheres. You are the star that made the skies all bright, yet tore itself away in flaming fright. You are the tree that suddenly awoke. You are the rose that came to life and spoke, guided by you, how we might stroll toward death. Our only music, one another's breath. Through gardens intimate with hollyhocks, where silent poppies burn between the rocks, by pools where birches bend to confidants, above green waters scummed with lily plants. There we might wander, you and I, alone, through gardens filled with marble seats, moss-grown, and fountains, water threads that winds disperse, while in the spray the birds sit and converse. And when the fireflies mix their circling glow through the dark plants, then gently might I know your lips as the wings of the dragonflies, merely dreams fluttering in my eyes. We're going to launch into part 2 of Peter Pan. First, I'll give you a little summary of part 1. Our story began with the reminder that all children, except one, grow up. We're introduced to the Darling family. Yes, that's their actual surname. Oh, adorable, right? Mrs. Darling is an exceptionally lovely lady with a romantic mind and a kiss that Wendy, her firstborn child, could never quite get, even though it was perfectly conspicuous in the right-hand corner of her sweet mouth. Mrs. Darling thought that Mr. Darling was quite honorable and respectable because he knows about stocks and shares and things that no one actually understands. He often said that stocks were up and shares were down in his own respectable way. After Wendy came John, and then came the youngest, Michael. Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors. So they had this keeping up with the Joneses curse. But they would absolutely have to have a nurse. As they were comparatively poor amongst their peers who also employed servants, their nurse was a prim Newfoundland hound named Nana. She was quite a treasure of a nurse who absolutely adored children, especially these 3 children, and took her responsibilities extremely seriously. Liza, a servant, was also part of the household at number 14. Number 14 is their address. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter Pan one night after the children were asleep, and she was tidying up her children's minds. When thinking back into her own childhood, Mrs. Darling just remembered a Peter Pan who is said to live with fairies. One morning, some leaves of a tree had been found on the nursery floor. Wendy said that she thought it was that Peter again. The next evening, Mrs. Darling had fallen asleep in the nursery while sitting in her chair with her sewing. She thought she was dreaming when Peter Pan appeared through the window, accompanied by a strange light no bigger than your fist. Somehow, she knew he was Peter Pan. And if you or I had been there, we should have seen he was very like Miss Darling's kiss. However, Mrs. Darling screamed, Nana entered, sprang at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. As he leapt out the window, Nana closed the window quickly, but only in time to catch his shadow. When Mr. Darling found out what had happened, he said, "It all comes of having a dog for a nurse." He can be a bit uppity and bothersome at times. It was only a week later that Mrs. Darling, Mr. Darling, and Nana were lamenting about how each one felt that they were personally to blame for that dreadful evening which had begun so uneventfully and turned into a never-to-be-forgotten Friday. From James M. Barrie. This is part 2 of Peter Pan, beginning with Chapter 3, called Come Away, Come Away. For a moment, after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the 3 children continued to burn clearly. They were awfully nice little night lights, and one cannot help wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter, but Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other 2 yawned also, and before they could close their mouths, all the 3 went out. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights, and in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers of the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged the wardrobe and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf cut low and square through which her figure could be seen to the best advantage. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinkerbell," he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle, as of golden bells, answered him. It is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands, the way kings toss halfpence to the crowd. In a moment, he had rediscovered his shadow, and in his delight, he forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer, if he thought at all, but I personally don't believe he ever thought. But if he ever thought, it was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in a bed. She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. "Boy," she said courteously. "Why are you crying?" Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned the grand manner at fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she replied with some satisfaction. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. "Is that all?" "Yes," he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a short-ish name. "I'm so sorry," said Wendy Moira. "I'm so sorry," said Wendy Moira Angela. "It doesn't matter." Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right, and then straight on till morning." "What a funny address!" Peter had a sinking. For the first time, he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was hostess, "is that what they put on the letters?" He wished she had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. "But your mother gets letters." "Don't have a mother," he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said rather indignantly. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying." "It has come off?" "Yes." Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. "It must be sewn on," she said, just a little patronizingly. "What's, sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "No, I'm not." But she was exulting in his ignorance. "I shall sew it on for you, my little man," she said, though he was tall as herself, and she got out her sewing kit and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. "I dare say it will hurt a little," she warned him. "Oh, I will not cry," said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth and did not cry, and soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. "Perhaps I should have ironed it," Wendy said thoughtfully, but Peter, boy-like, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself. "How clever I am!" he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me!" It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with a brutal frankness, there never was a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. "You conceit!" she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "Of course I did nothing." "Yep, you did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. "A little," she replied with hauteur. "If I'm no use, I can at least withdraw." And she sprang in the most dignified way into the bed and covered her face with the blankets. To induce her to look up, he pretended to be going away. And when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. "Wendy," he said, "don't withdraw. I can't help crowing, Wendy, when I'm pleased with myself." Still, she would not look up, though she was listening eagerly. "Wendy," he continued, in a voice that no woman has ever yet been able to resist. "Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys." Now, Wendy was every inch a woman, though there were not many inches yet, and she peeped out of the bedclothes. "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do." "I think it's perfectly sweet of you," she declared, "and I'll get up again." And she sat with him on the side of the bed. She also said she would give him a kiss if he liked. But Peter did not know what she meant, and he held out his hand expectantly. "Surely you know what a kiss is?" she asked, aghast. "I shall know when you give it to me," he replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. "Now," said he, "shall I give you a kiss?" And she replied with a slight primness, "If you please." She made herself rather cheap by inclining her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand. So she slowly returned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did put it on that chain, for it was afterwards to save her life. When people in our set are introduced, it is customary for them to ask each other's age, and so Wendy, who always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was. It was not really a happy question to ask him. It was like an examination paper that asks grammar when what you want to be asked is about the kings of England. "I don't know," he replied uneasily, "but I am quite young." He really knew nothing about it. He had mere suspicions, but he said at a venture, "Wendy, I ran away the day I was born." Wendy was quite surprised, but interested, and she indicated in the charming drawing-room manner by a touch on her nightgown that he could sit nearer her. "It was because I heard Father and Mother," he explained in a low voice, "talking about what I was to be when I became a man." He was extraordinarily agitated now. "I didn't want ever to be a man," he said with passion. I want always to be a little boy and just to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies. She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies. Wendy had lived such a home life that to know fairies struck her as quite delightful. She poured out questions about them to his surprise, for they were rather a nuisance to him, getting in his way and so on. Still, he liked them on the whole, and he told her about the beginning of fairies. You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. Tedious talk this, but being a stay-at-home, she liked it. And so, he went on good-naturedly, there ought to be one fairy for every boy and girl. Ought to be, isn't there? No. You see, children know such a lot now that they soon don't believe in fairies. And every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. Really, he thought they had now talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinkerbell was keeping very quiet. I can't think where she's gone to, he said, rising, and he called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went flutter with a sudden thrill. Peter, she cried, clutching him, you don't mean to tell me that there's a fairy in this room? She was here just now, he said a little patiently. You don't hear her, do you? And they both listened. The only sound I hear, said Wendy, is like a tinkle of bells. Well, that's Tink. That's the fairy language. I think I hear her too. The sound came from the chest of drawers, and Peter made a merry face. No one could ever look quite so merry as Peter, and the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. He had his first laugh still. Wendy, he whispered gleefully, I do believe I shut her up in the drawer. He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery, screaming with fury. You shouldn't say such things, Peter retorted. Of course, I'm very sorry. How could I know you were in the drawer? Wendy was not listening to him. Oh, Peter, she cried, if she would only stand still and let me see her. They hardly ever stand still, he said, but for one moment, Wendy saw the romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. Oh, the lovely, she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. Tink, said Peter amiably, this lady says she wishes you were her fairy. Tinkerbell answered insolently. What does she say, Peter? He had to translate. She's not very polite. She says, you are a great ugly girl, and that she is my fairy. He tried to argue with Tink. You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, because I'm a gentleman and you are a lady. To this, Tink replied in these words, you silly ass, and disappeared into the bathroom. She's quite a common fairy, Peter explained apologetically. She's called Tinker Bell because she mends the pots and kettles. They were together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy plied him with more questions. If you don't live in Kensington Gardens now, sometimes I do, still, but where do you live mostly now? with the Lost Boys. Who are they? Well, they're the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. If they're not claimed in 7 days, they're sent far away to the Neverland to defray expenses. I'm Captain.
What fun it must be!
Yes, said cunning Peter. But we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship.
Are none of the others girls?
Oh, no. Girls, are much too clever to fall out of their prams. This flattered Wendy immensely.
I think, she said, it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John, there, just despises us.
For reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of bed, blankets and all. One kick. This seemed to Wendy rather forward for a first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so placidly on the floor that she allowed him to remain there.
And I know you meant to be kind, she said relentingly. So, you may give me a kiss.
For the moment, she had forgotten his ignorance about kisses. I thought you would want it back, he said, a little bitterly, and offered to return her the thimble.
Oh dear, said the nice Wendy. I don't mean a kiss. I mean a thimble.
What's that?
It's like this.
And she kissed him. Funny, said Peter gravely. Now shall I give you a thimble?
If you wish to, said Wendy,
keeping her head erect this time. Peter thimbled her, and almost immediately she screeched, What is it, Wendy?
It was exactly as if someone were pulling my hair.
That must have been Tink. I never knew her so naughty before. And indeed, Tink was darting about again, using offensive language. She says she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you a thimble.
But why?
Why, Tink? Again, Tink replied,
You silly ass!
Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood. And she was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he came to the nursery window not to see her, but to listen to stories. You see, I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys know any stories.
How perfectly awful,
Wendy said. Do you know, Peter asked, why swallows build in the eaves of houses? It is to listen to the stories.
Wendy, your mother was telling you such a lovely story. Which story was it?
About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper?
Wendy, Peter, said Wendy excitedly, that was Cinderella. And he found her, and they lived happily ever after.
Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window.
Where are you going?
She cried with misgiving. To tell the other boys.
Don't go, Peter, she entreated. I know lots of such stories.
Those were her precise words, so there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him. He came back, and there was a greedy look in his eyes now, which ought to have alarmed her, but did not.
Oh, the stories I could tell to the boys,
she cried, and then Peter gripped her and began to draw her toward the window.
Let me go, she ordered him. Wendy, do come with me and tell the other boys.
Of course, she was very pleased to be asked, but she said,
Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mummy. Besides, I can't fly.
I'll teach you.
Oh, how lovely to fly.
I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then away we go.
Oh,
she exclaimed rapturously. Wendy, when you are sleeping in your silly bed, you might be flying about with me, saying funny things to the stars.
Oh.
And Wendy, there are mermaids.
Mermaids? With tails?
Such long tails.
Oh, cried Wendy, to see a mermaid.
He'd become frightfully cunning. Wendy, he said, how we should all respect you. She was wriggling her body in distress. It was quite as if she were trying to remain on the nursery floor, but he had no pity for her. Wendy, he said, the sly one, you could tuck us in at night. None of us has ever been tucked in at night.
Oh!
And her arms went out to him, and you could darn our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has ever had any pockets. How could she resist?
Of course, it's awfully fascinating, she cried. Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly, too?
If you like, he said indifferently. And she ran to John and Michael and shook them.
Wake up, she cried. Peter Pan has come, and he is to teach us to fly.
John rubbed his eyes. And I shall get up, he said. Of course, he was on the floor already. Hello, he said. I'm up. Michael was up by this time also, looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw, but Peter suddenly signed silence. Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children, listening for sounds from the grown-up world. All was still as salt. Then everything was right. No, stop! Everything was wrong! Nana, who had been barking distressfully all the evening, was quiet now. It was her silence they had heard.
Out with the light! Hide, quick!
Cried John, taking command for the only first time throughout the entire adventure, the first and only time throughout the entire adventure. And thus, when Liza entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self, very dark, and you would have sworn you heard its 3 wicked inmates breathing angelically as they slept. They were really doing it artfully from behind the window curtains. Liza was in a bad temper, for she was mixing the Christmas puddings in the kitchen and had been drawn from them with a raisin still on her cheek by Nana's absurd suspicions. She thought the best way of getting a little quiet was to take Nana to the nursery for a moment, but in custody, of course. There, you suspicious brute, she said, not sorry that Nana was in disgrace. They're perfectly safe, aren't they? Every one of the little angels sound asleep in bed. Listen to their gentle breathing. Here, Michael, encouraged by his success, breathed so loudly that they were nearly detected. Nana knew that kind of breathing, and she tried to drag herself out of Liza's clutches, but Liza was dense. No more of it, Nana, she said sternly, pulling her out of the room. I warn you, if you bark again, I shall go straight for Master and the missus and bring him home from the party, and then, oh, won't Master just whip you just? She tied the unhappy dog up again. But do you think Nana ceased to bark? Bring Master and Mrs. home from the party? That was just what she wanted. Do you think she cared whether she was whipped so long as her charges were safe? Unfortunately, Liza returned to her puddings, and Nana, seeing that no help would come from her, strained and strained at the chain until at last she broke it. In another moment, she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung up her paws to heaven, her most expressive way of making a communication. Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once that something terrible was happening in their nursery, and without a goodbye to their hostess, they rushed into the street. But it was now 10 minutes since 3 scoundrels had been breathing behind the curtains, and Peter Pan can do a great deal in 10 minutes. We now return to the nursery.
"It's all right," John announced, emerging from his hiding place. "I say, Peter, can you really fly?" Instead of troubling to answer him, Peter flew around the room, taking the mantelpiece on the way. "How chopping!" said John and Michael. "How sweet!" cried Wendy.
"Yes, I am sweet. Oh, I am sweet," said Peter, forgetting his manners again. It looked delightfully easy, and they tried it first from the floor and then from the beds, but they always went down instead of up.
"I say, how do you do it?" asked John, rubbing his knee. He was quite a practical boy.
"Oh, you just think lovely, wonderful thoughts," Peter explained, "and they lift you up in the air." He showed them. Again.
"You're so nippy at it," John said. "Couldn't you do it very slowly once?"
Peter did it both slowly and quickly.
"I've got it now, Wendy," cried John,
but soon he found he had not. Not one of them could fly an inch. Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless the fairy dust has been blown on them. Fortunately, as we have mentioned, one of Peter's hands was messy with fairy dust, and he blew some on each of them with the most superb results. "Now, just wiggle your shoulders this way," he said, "and let go." They were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first. He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room. "I flew!" he screamed while still in midair. John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom. "Oh, lovely! Oh, ripping! Look at me! Look at me! Look at me!" They were not nearly so elegant as Peter. They could not help kicking a little, but their heads were bobbing against the ceiling, and there is almost nothing so delicious as that. Peter gave Wendy a hand first, but had to desist because Tink was so indignant. Up and down they went, and round. "Heavenly," was Wendy's word. "I say," cried John, "why shouldn't we go out?" Of course, it was to this that Peter had been luring them. Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took them to do 1,000,000,000 miles, but Wendy hesitated. "Mermaids," Peter said again. "Oh, and there are pirates." "Pirates!" cried John, seizing his Sunday hat. "Let us go at once!" It was just at this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling hurried with Nana out of 27. They ran into the middle of the street to look up at the nursery window, and yes, it was still shut, but the room was ablaze with light. And most heart-gripping sight of all, they could see in the shadow on the curtain 3 little figures in night attire circling round and round, not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3 figures. 4. In a tremble, they
opened the street door. Mr. Darling would have rushed upstairs, but Mrs. Darling signed to him to go softly. She even tried to make her heart go softly. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them, and we shall all breathe a sigh of relief. But there would be no story. On the other hand, if they were not in time, I solemnly promise that it will all come out right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time had it not been that the little stars were watching them. Once again, the stars blew the window open, and that smallest star of all cried out, "Cave, Peter." Then Peter knew that there was not a moment to lose. "Come!" he cried imperiously and soared out at once into the night, followed by John and Michael and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late. The birds were flown. End of part 2. And now for Ask Hunter Anything, where I answer questions submitted by you, the viewers. Please know that these episodes are live streamed on the Hunter's Acoustic Cabin YouTube channel every Monday evening at 9 o'clock California time, before they're made into this broadcast version. So you may hear reference to those who chat with me during my answers. And hey, if you have a question that you would like answered on Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang, email me using the email address AskHunterAnything@gmail.com. The concept behind Ask Hunter Anything is that some people collect baseball cards. Some people collect stamps or coins. I collect interesting questions. And if you have such an interesting question, please drop it into the email of AskHunterAnything@gmail.com. So I had a long, fascinating conversation with a young guy, I'll say he's a kid, who told me he was into science fiction. And he told me several of the things that he had read recently and several of the things he was into right now. He has watched every episode of the YouTube channel Kurzgot, which I may be mispronouncing, but is one of the many science explanation videos, video channels that I watch on a regular basis. And so I knew we had at least a commonality of language and terms that I could relate to in terms of things that I've heard Kurzgot explain. In asking for reading recommendations in science fiction, I immediately said Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Philip K. Dick. He had never heard of any of them. And I said, "Oh, my child, welcome to the brave new world of science fiction. And by the way, you should also read Aldous Huxley." He wrote all 4 names down exuberantly. And it came to a distinction in classifications of science fiction in very broad strokes at one point in the conversation. The distinction was brought up as, what do I mean by the distinction between hard science fiction and soft science fiction? So the simple term for this, hard sci-fi, would be something like Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, where physics, logic, reason play very strongly into the plot. We don't just ignore gravity because it's convenient to move the story forward, by example. Rick and Morty would be hard sci-fi. And when they do defy physics, it is not without some explanation. Rick has some kind of device that fill in the blank. Similarly, in Star Trek, up and down seem to be more meaningful in space than up and down should be. But at some point in Star Trek, they just explain it away with their artificial gravity device. So they at least acknowledge it. If you ever read Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, this is about contact with an alien space station that sort of wanders in close to Earth. And it has an artificial gravity inside its space station, not just by some hand-waving device that makes up, up, and down, down, but it is a constantly revolving cylinder. And in the exact same way that if you were to take a yo-yo on a string, the yo-yo feels a pseudo-force, feels an outside pressure. There is a carnival ride and something similar at your local Six Flags that will do this, where you get inside a cylinder, you lean up against the wall, the thing spins, and then the floor drops out and you stick to the wall, because by centrifugal force, you are stuck to the wall. That's how the artificial gravity works on the space station Rama in Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama. Soft sci-fi, by contrast, would be science fiction that has a plot or story that is unveiled without necessarily that much strong regard to physics or necessarily to logic. I'm tempted to give Star Wars as an example of this, because Star Wars is never really strong on physics. On the other hand, anybody that's watching this that is really into literary genres will also know that Star Wars is actually more of a branch of fantasy, frequently described as, let's say, the hero's journey in a science fiction setting. But if we were to not be so litigious as to acknowledge that and to just say, it's futuristic, even though it's in a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago, we're going to say it's futuristic because of the technology in the science fiction setting. This would definitely be soft sci-fi. One of the examples that this young man had read that I've also read is something called the Red Rising books, the Red Rising saga. That's R-E-D, Rising. It's compelling. It's like it's a page turner. It's a very fast moving plot. I think I read the first two books, and there's some really fascinating crossover between science fiction and Greek mythology, but it's not. It doesn't use how do we get around special relativity and time dilation as plot points, for example. Hard sci-fi would absolutely do that. So I think I will cut it off there with that one distinction, is the difference between hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. Soft sci-fi is really just looking at plots and characters. Hard sci-fi is ideally not ignoring plots and characters, but is very much looking at reality and how the universe operates as far as we currently understand it.
From the book A Pushcart at the Curb, published in 1922 by John dos Passos. This poem is called Phases of the Moon. Again, they are plowing the field by the river. In the air exultant, a smell of wild garlic crushed out by the shining steel in the furrow that opens softly behind the heavy-paced horses. Dark, moist, noisy, with fluttering of sparrows and their chirping, and the clink of the harness chimes like bells, and the plowman walks at one side with sliding steps, his body thrown back from the waist. Oh, the sudden sideways lift of his back and his arms as he swings the plow from the furrow. And behind the river, sheening blue, and the white beach, and the sails of schooners, and hoarsely laughing the black crows wheel and glint. Ha! Ha ha! Other springs you answered their laughing and shouted at them across the fallow lands that smelt of wild garlic and pine woods and earth. This year the crows flap, cawing overhead. Ha! Ha ha! And the plow harness clinks, and the pines echo the morning shore. No one laughs back at the laughing crows. No one shouts from the edge of the new plowed field. Sandy Point. From the book 8 Harvard Poets, 1917. This is The Bridge by John dos Passos. The lonely bridge cuts dark across the marsh, whose long pools glow with the light of a flaring summer sunset. At this end, limp bushes overhang, palely reflected in the amber-colored water. Among them a constant banjo twanging of frogs and shrilling of toads and of insects rises and falls in chorus rhythmic and stirring, dark with crumbling railing and planks. The bridge leads into the sunset. Across it, many lonely figures, their eyes aflare with the sunset, their faces glowing with its colors, tramp past me through the evening. I'm tired of sitting quiet among the bushes of the shore, while the dark bridge stretches onward, and the long pools gleam with light. I'm tired of the shrilling of insects and the croaking of frogs in the rushes, for the wild rice in the marsh pools waves its beckoning streamers in the wind, and the red sky glory fades. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. You can view more of my work at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. In memory of Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T UVerse Channel 99.